So, of all the horrific pictures we've seen in the last 5 months, the one of Kristi Noem, who's the head of Department of Homeland Security in that prison in El Salvador, has to be about the worst. I mean, you can remember, we all saw it, the pictures of all those men who'd been stripped and shaved and shorn, and their hands shackled, and they were in those contorted positions. And she was standing there kind of decked out like a model, right, in her tight jeans and her tight white T-shirt and all of her Botox and her hair and her makeup and the $50,000 Rolex watch. I mean, it was just such a horrific image. But behind that image is a history that we may not all be as aware of. It's a history of colonization of Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, all of it. So you run back, 1500s, the Spanish came to Central America, what we call Central America, and kind of stripped the people of their indigenous language and the culture and basically oppressed the Mayan people and kind of made it into their own banana republic. And then the United States came along with our big fruit companies around 1899, 1900, and the United Fruit Company set the place up, and it really became a banana republic in many ways, kind of sponsored by U.S. military. And they really took the country, and they really did set up, like in El Salvador, the 14, which means the 14 ruling families who had all the power and money, and everybody else was basically in kind of slave-like conditions. And they were farming the bananas and the cocoa and the chocolate and putting down the railroads, and it was a system of brutal oppression that was sponsored, and there were these massacres and rebellions and more, some recently, like remember in 1952, Guatemala elected a democratic leader, and then the CIA-backed coup of our money overturned it. And then in the wars of liberation in the 1980s, that kind of swept through Central America. Often, sadly, our foreign policy reflected more our economic interest than our concern for human rights. So this is sort of like the history behind Kristi Noem standing there. I mean, it's very much like we, the light-skinned people, are colonizing you. And there they are, chained and shackled and powerless. And sadly, some of that history has been propped up by the church. It's just true. If you read the history of the colonization of the Americas or Africa, I think about before the Germans and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the English and the French and the Spanish carved up the continent of Africa, arriving at the Cape and just marching up through there beginning in the 1600s. Before they sent the soldiers, who did they send? The missionaries, right? The missionaries kind of went, kind of claiming this is God's country, this is our manifesto. So they came literally, and you can see these, in carvings, they're carrying the cross, and then right behind them are the people with the swords and the muskets, right? So there is this very sad history that we have to own. And then in this passage from Acts is such an interesting book. I always, kind of read this book pretty uncritically, like, oh, here we are, the expansion of the church, and, we're going out there, and Peter and Paul are spreading the word, and how we are God's love spread out on the world. But then when you back up, you have to see at least some part of the handprint of colonization. And there's a lot of violence in this scripture. Like, I don't know if you heard it, right? These people are being flayed and beaten and tortured and flogged and wrapped in shackles. And a lot of times we think of, well, the Christians were the persecuted ones, right? True. But Christians were also kind of dealing it out a little bit too, right? I mean, if you think of violence as not just, physically torturing people, but also going in there and kind of like stripping them of their pagan gods and their ways, right? I mean, there's an inherent violence in that. So in the passage today is a really fascinating one, at least to me. It's the story of Lydia, and that may not be like a name that pops to our forefront of our heads, but she's a very formative, important figure as we try and kind of understand the role of women and the role of people who are oppressed too in the early Christian community. Like a feminist companion to the Acts of the Apostles, there's 14 scholarly journal articles in there, and 6 of them are about Lydia. Another 2 are about Lydia and the slave girl. She really plays this pretty important role. So in the simple story, Paul and Timothy are on their missionary journey. They come to Philippi, and there it's the Sabbath. They're going to go out and pray. They go down by the river, and they see this group of women who are gathering. Lydia is right there at the center. She hears them preaching. She's converted, and then her household with her. And that's been a really important passage, a way of people saying women must have been leaders in the early church. Here she is. Even if these women might have been married, they still have their own household. We're told that they had some independence and some power. And so she's converted, and all of the other people with her, it's like she's there and all of her friends, she's an influencer, right? They all go into the waters and they're all baptized. But then more recently, some scholars have looked at it and said, well, really, maybe the power she had wasn't about money, because you can make expensive products that you can't afford, right? We all know people who farm and harvest strawberries they can't buy and they could never afford, and little children who mine minerals to go in our cell phones that they'll never be able to afford, right? So people have said maybe she wasn't so much a rich woman just because she dealt in purple, her own Rolex watch in a way, and, was a founder of this community. Maybe there's a cheap way to make purple too, and one of those is made expensive with purple dye, and one of them is made with snails that's really messy that you do down by the river, and that's where these women were. So there's kind of like, who is this woman? But then, which I find, again, that's very interesting, we know that in what we call the Christian scriptures or the New Testament, we know that often they're quoting the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, but sometimes they're also quoting like Greek plays. So underneath this passage is Euripides' play called The Bacchae, which was written 400 BC, which is almost exactly like this, almost at places word for word. And in that story, Dionysius is the god. He's like the son of Zeus, and he's on his own missionary journey to convert women. He's wearing purple. He shows up. His words are at times the exact words that Paul uses or Luke uses. And then he also has, like, they go to jail, and then there's an earthquake, and they're freed. And it's like, but there's one big difference. In Dionysius, the women are converted, and when they're converted, they dance in a frenzied pattern, and they have sexual energy and all these things, right? In Luke's version, when the women are converted, they're praying, right? And you can see how this is a more acceptable version to the Roman Empire, right? You don't have to worry about our women. They're not going to be in an orgiastic frenzy. No, they're just going to be with their hands folded praying, right? So you can see what I'm saying here, right? There's this Jesus who's moving and freeing people and also controlling people, right? And controlling their bodies and controlling who they are. And then in the next story, which we won't spend a lot of time on, but is a really fascinating story with the slave girl who, again, is under the control of these men, kind of prostituted for whatever it is that she can do. And then she's healed, and then she is pushed off the stage. We never hear a word about her again, even though in Acts 2 we're told what? That God's Spirit is poured out on all the slaves. Even the men and the women, they're all able to prophesy. But this slave goes away, and then all the action involves men kind of arguing over power, right? Paul and Silas, and then the men who owned her are angry because Paul and Silas have taken away, they're her Johns, and they've taken away the money, and they go into the jail, and the earthquake frees them. But underneath that, instead, the women that emerge, the women who are prophesying, are 4 virgins in Acts 21. Again, it's like, well, that's a good role for women, right? And even though the word virgin is not just used for women, the word virgin is basically used for women, about control of their bodies. And so then, you come to this point and you're thinking, okay, well, what does this matter to anybody? It matters to me because I've been thinking a lot in my own life about what it means to control versus to connect. And I think right now, when we're in such a difficult spot, having some real simple, slogans at least in front of me, like each day, how am I going to connect in a world that keeps telling me to control? I've never seen a world like this, right? Before, where we have a president who is all of a sudden he's all about colonization. He's all about conquest, right? He's talking about taking over Canada and Greenland and Gaza. Who would ever have thought of this, right? It's this we use people, we exploit people, we take people over, and we're not even going to pretend that we don't, right? This is just like who we are. And we control women's bodies, and we control queer people, and we just control. And then I've been thinking my own life too, like my own most basic relationships, like my most intense relationships, Eden and Ben, Joe's easy, you all, staff, the world, right? But am I connecting or am I controlling? And even before I send a text or get on the phone, especially with my kids, to try to stop and think, am I going to connect or am I trying to control, right? And who are the people who encourage us and give us examples of what that looks like? So one of my heroes, you all have heard me talk about them many times, is that company Equal Exchange, the nonprofit. Equal Exchange was started 40 years ago next year by three kind of hippy-dippy New England guys who were working at a New England cooperative, and this is in the 80s, and they're thinking, how can we start a legitimately fair trade operation? All the wars in Central America were raging at the time, and so they began developing really strong relationships, connections, solidarity movements with small farmers throughout Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras. You know, people who had been farming cacao, you know, it goes into chocolate and coffee beans and all that, and being paid nothing, living in a plantation system, and getting people in a village to form a co-op. And they began like marketing. And over these 40 years, they have developed hundreds of relationships and helped thousands of small farmers and villages like come up with a world where people can live in decent dignity and some hope. And about 10 years ago, though, one of them said, fair trade is dead. You know, he just had to say it. He just said, you know, what we hoped for, that we would start a movement where people around, all the big companies would say, we really shouldn't have 6-year-olds working in slave-like conditions. And we really shouldn't be just raping the earth. We should look at sustainable farming. And instead what happened was Folgers and Nestle and all the big companies lobbied enough so that fair trade is so watered down that you can call yourself fair trade and you have a 6-year-old minding your stuff, right? And so instead, he came up with this question, which I've talked about before in church, but stays in front of me. He said, this is the challenge. Would you like to be a part of a really tiny model that's trying to challenge a world system that oppresses most people? I mean, that's what we're doing, folks. That's what this church is. This is a really tiny, a very tiny model today, particularly, that's trying to challenge a world system that oppresses most people. You know, that's kind of what the church, in many ways, at its core. I'm not talking about the BS of those people in the White House. No, that is not Christian. There's nothing about that that is Christian. We have to call that crap out, right? I'm talking about a movement of liberation that says every single person is valued and cherished and has to be protected and honored. Do we want to be a part of a system like that? And like one of the groups that they work with at Equal Exchange is a group of Arab and Israeli women, a cooperative called Sindiana. Maybe for 20 or 30 years, they've been making a lot of products, including olive oil, and talk about trying a tiny model in a place of conquest and domination and exploitation. And a few years ago, they were looking for a new logo, and they got their children together, Arab and Israeli children, and they said, when you hear the word togetherness or love or peace, what comes to mind? So the kids started doing all this stuff, making this art, and then they put new labels on their product. Extra peaceful olive oil, extra hopeful olive oil, extra unified olive oil. And I don't know if they intentionally did it, but the word virgin went away, which is so, I don't even know if they thought of that, because of course the word virgin in this context refers to olives that are going through their first press, but virgin, the word, is about oppressing and controlling women. You know, what does that mean to push back in a thoughtful way and say we want to be peaceful and hopeful and unified and positive and loving, right? Not controlling. And then I thought about my daughter's candidate, Jesse Vogel, who just won his primary, which was for Columbus City Council. And he was not the endorsed candidate by every single other city council person who was in office. He was the AOC candidate, the Working Families Party candidate, the LGBTQ Victory Fund. Jesse is a great guy. He's in his young 30s. He's brilliant. He went to law school at Ohio State. He interned at the most exclusive law firm in New York City. And then he was like, yeah, I really want to work with people who are in danger of being evicted and deported. So he came back to Columbus, worked for Legal Aid. Now he works for CRIS, where my daughter has volunteered some, Columbus Refugee Services with Haitian refugees, and he and 4 other attorneys are right there in Columbus trying to protect the most vulnerable people you've ever known. He's a really good guy, and he was interviewed. He's interviewed a lot these days as they gear up for the general in November. He was asked about empathy, and he talked about his own life, because growing up, as he said, a skinny, gay, Jewish redhead kid, he often felt excluded. So he said every time he is with somebody, whether it's Eva, who's got a PhD in physics, or Adrian, one of my daughter's best friend, who rides a bus every single day to try to make it, whatever, he looks at the person and he thinks, this person is a real person. This is a real person right in front of me. This is a person whose backgrounds and history and ideas and opinions and thoughts might be very, very different from me, but this is a real person. I mean, it's such a basic thing, right? But every single day, every single interaction, we have an opportunity to step back and think, what am I trying to do here? Am I trying to control, or am I trying to connect? Am I trying to really hear you, understand you, or am I just trying to push off my own crap on you? I mean, it's a challenge. But here we are, the last Sunday of Eastertide, and we are asked again and again and again, over and over and over again, what does it mean that we are God's love poured out on this earth? That is what we are. We are God's love poured out on this earth. And we have to find a way to speaking honestly and challenging anyone who misuses that and labels that and seeks to dominate or exploit or hurt other people. And we have to keep checking our own lives too and asking how each day in such a difficult time, it's such a rough time, how can we just grow a little bit, stretch a little bit, try to be a little bit more the faithful people we're called to be. Amen.